Facebook group. I posted something about the links. You can actually click on the links and follow along as you want. But what I'll also be doing is that the context being that I just went for an executive retreat with Ajahn Brahm just last week, and what he has kindly agreed to let us do is to actually use his latest translation of this text called The Word of the Buddha. So The Word of the Buddha was actually this compilation of sutta extracts done by this monk called Nyena Tilokatara. He was one of the first Western monks, German, who was a monk in Sri Lanka in the World War II, that period. And what he did was extract the suttas and put it into the Four Noble Truths as well as the Eightfold Paths. So you can actually see what did the Buddha actually teach for each of these Four Noble Truths and Eightfold Paths. The downside of the Word of the Buddha is that because it was done like in 1930s, that period, the language is very, very, very old-fashioned. So what Ajahn Brahm has done is that he has actually revised the translation based on his understanding of Pali. So it's modernized it. So for example, in one of the sutta talks, the original text was actually talking about comparing something to a lathe. And Ajahn Brahm was like commenting, but nobody uses a mechanical lathe, L-A-T-H-E, a lathe nowadays. So he changed the analogy to something about like more like painting, where you know whether something is a long stroke or a short stroke. And this was when the Buddha was talking about observing the breathing. Hi, please come in. Yeah, we just started. Yeah. So instead of the original analogy of a carpenter's plane, which the Buddha said is like a carpenter planing wood, and you know whether it's a long stroke or a short stroke. And very few people use that nowadays. You have those like automatic shapers or tools, right? Ajahn Brahm was saying that everybody has painted a house, so you know whether it's a long stroke or a short stroke when painted. And he's done modernization like that. So he has kindly agreed to let us use his excerpts, for the purposes of this series as well. And that's what I'll do. So I'll pick and combine like where appropriate. So the first sutta is actually from the Anguttara Nikaya, 6.63, and specifically from section 5. And we're talking about Kamma. So today the topic is about cause and effect, right? So Kamma. And what the Buddha said is, volition is Kamma. For having will, you act by body, speech, and mind. And what is the cause of karma? What's the cause of the action? Contact is the cause of karma. And by this contact, just to take a short note, contact means actually the interaction between your 5 aggregates. In this case, actually, like your physical world touching, say for example that you feel something, right? And it feels very nice. And it's that interaction between that physical sensation with your consciousness of that sense of touch. That is what is called contact. And that arises actually the objects of consciousness, which then leads to actually you attaching to it, and then subsequently you develop the will, the intention to want to do something. So cause of karma is contact. And it's not just contact of physical touch, it's all 6 senses. Seeing, hearing, smelling, taste, touch, and also the mind. When your mind actually has contact with a mind object, when you imagine something, for example, or when you experience something in the mind, right, that's also another form of contact. So contact is the cause of karma. And what is the diversity in karma? Diversity meaning like what are different kinds of karma that there is, right? There's karma to be experienced in hell realms. There's karma to be experienced in the realm of common animals. There's karma to be experienced in the realm of affected spirits, which is like ghosts. Karma to be experienced in the human world. Karma to be experienced in the world of the devas. This is called diversity in karma. So just to pause here, this means actually that there are many different kinds of karma, and they are actually specific to the different realms of existence. Human realm being one of them, but there's also the animal realm like karma. There's also like spirits and all that. So that's actually what's called the diversity of karma. But more importantly, I think is the next part. And what is the result of karma? The result of karma, I say, is threefold. To be experienced in this very life, or in the next life, or in some subsequent life. This is called the result of karma, and that's like Ajahn Brahm's translation. So what this means, right, if you logically think about it, is whatever you're doing now, you might not see the fruit of it you might see the fruit of it in three ways. Either now, in this life, meaning that it can be in the next hour, next month, next year, or whatever it is, right, until you die. It can be next life, or it can be subsequent lives. But if we look at where we are now and we look backwards, that means that a lot of what we're experiencing now is actually the result of past karma as well. Right? Physically, you are here because of past karma. You are in a relatively, the fact that you're not actually in a war zone right now is probably because of like past karma as well. Right? So we'll talk more about it in the next sutta or karma. And what is the cessation of karma? From the cessation of contact, meaning that when contact ceases, that's when karma ceases. And how do you actually cease contact? And it's just this eightfold path. Right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right samadhi. And this is the path of practice leading to ceasing of the karma. So this is from Anguttara, the AN6.63. Now we've spoken about the results of karma, right? That there's this life, next life, or subsequent life. So I'll move on to the next sutta, which is actually Majjhima Nikaya 135. Right? It's a very long name. It's called the Chula Kamma Vibhanga Sutta, which literally means the shorter Chula. Kamma, it's Kamma Vibhanga, literally the analysis of karma. Right? So this is actually an interesting sutta because it actually has, amongst the entire Pali canon, this has the most number of parallels. So there are something like 7 or 8 Chinese parallels in the Ahansing, the Agamas. There's a Sanskrit version, there's a Tibetan version, there's a Khotanese version as well. And I think the reason why this is so popular is because it talks about the nature of karma's fruit. Right? So I'll just start by reading the Pali and then I'll just interject with the commentary as and where appropriate. Thus have I heard. On one occasion, the Blessed One was living at Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's park. So this is actually in modern-day Shravasti in Uttar Pradesh in India right now. Then the Brahmin student Subha, Todaya's son, went to the Blessed One and exchanged greetings with him. When this courteous and amiable talk was finished, he sat down on one side and asked the Blessed One, Master Gautama, what is the cause and condition why human beings are seen to be inferior and superior? For people are seen to be short-lived and long-lived, sickly and healthy, ugly and beautiful, uninfluential and influential, poor and wealthy, low-born and high-born, stupid and wise. What is the cause and the condition, Master Gautama, why human beings are seen to be inferior and superior? So, by the fact that he calls the Buddha Master Gautama, this means that actually he's not a Buddhist. Actually, right? It means that actually he's just a Brahmin student. He's not really a follower of the Buddha at this point in time. Because if he's a follower of the Buddha in the suttas, they call him like Blessed One. They would address him as like Bhagava, a Blessed One. So the Buddha replies, Student, beings are owners of their actions, meaning owners of their karma, heirs of their karma, and they originate from their karma, are bound to their karma, have karma as their refuge, and it is karma that distinguishes beings as inferior and superior. And so Subha then says, I do not understand in detail the meaning of Master Gautama's statement, which you spoke in brief without expounding the meaning in detail. It would be good if you could teach me the Dhamma so that I can understand in detail the meaning. So I'll just pause here because there's actually a very big difference between the Pali canon and its parallels. The big difference, right, okay, actually, in terms of the overall sutta, the content actually is the same. So I'll expound on the content later. But what is different is actually the context. Like, so in this sutta, this guy goes to the Buddha and then he asks, like, so what's the cause for people like being like, beautiful, not beautiful, and so on and so forth, right? But in the Chinese suttas, right, the context actually is slightly different. So what happened in the Chinese suttas is that the Buddha was going out for alms round in Savatthi, where he stayed for 40-something years. And while he was in alms round in this guy's Suba's house, there was a dog that was standing on the table and started barking at the Buddha. And the Buddha actually like reprimanded the dog. And so the Suba actually saw that and he was a little bit surprised, like why would the Buddha like reprimand the dog? And so he asked the Buddha that, and the Buddha said, this dog was your father in his past life. And Suba's father had passed away some time ago and he could not believe it because he's a Brahmin student, right? So it's like quite highborn, right? So for his father to be also a Brahmin to be like reborn as a dog, was like, wow, what the heck is going on? So he then asked the Buddha, like, no, I don't believe that my father was like reborn as a dog. To which then the Buddha actually told him a few things to test out. So he asked, and when in the Buddha's absence, Suba then went to ask the dog to show him things that only Suba's father would have known, including, so Suba's father was renowned in the whole town of Savatthi as being a miser, very rich but very miserly. So, and also quite arrogant. So he asked the dog, like, show me where my father buried his treasure. And the dog went over and started digging up in this place that nobody else knows. And Suba was with the dog and he saw that the dog dug up this huge treasure that only the father had buried and told him. And that's when he was convinced. And then he went to the Buddha to ask, and this is where the Pali canon comes in. And then the rest is the same. Then they asked the Buddha, like, why is it that people are like born in a bad realm? So I mentioned that this is the most number of parallels. I mentioned also about like how the setting is like quite different. But otherwise, actually, they are largely the same. The only difference is that in the Chinese, Sanskrit, and the Tibetan text, right, they add a little bit more details, which I'll cover in a little bit. So the Buddha went on and said, here, student, some man or woman kills living beings and is murderous, bloody-handed, given to blows and violence, merciless to living beings. And because of performing such karma on the dissolution of the body, meaning that when the body like disappears after death, he or she appears in a state of deprivation, in an unhappy place, even in hell. But if he does not appear in hell and instead comes back into the human realm, wherever he is reborn, he will be short-lived. This is the way that leads to short life. Namely, one kills living beings, is murderous. Oh, there's somebody at the door. Please come in. Yeah, please come in. Yeah. Bloody-handed, given to blows and violence, and is merciless to living beings. Hi, please come in. Yeah. But here, student, some man or woman, abandoning the killing of living beings, abstains from killing living beings, with rod and weapon laid aside, is gentle and kindly, is compassionate to all living beings. After death, he appears in a happy destination, even in heaven. But if he doesn't appear in the heavenly world but comes back to the human state, wherever he is reborn, he is long-lived. This is the way that leads to long life. Namely, the abandoning of killing living beings, with rod and weapon laid aside, being gentle, being kindly, being compassionate to all living beings. So I just pause here. So clearly, like the way to have a short life is to go kill and be a mass murderer, and then next life, if you are not in hell, you will come back and you will have a very short life, right? Does this then mean that we shouldn't have any compassion for those who have short lives? Let's discuss that later. I'll move on first. Moving on to the next part, right? Here, some man or woman is given to injuring beings with the hand, with a stick, with a knife, and because of such an action, you might appear in hell. It doesn't appear in hell, then when they come back to the human state, then they will actually be sickly. This is the way that leads to sickliness, meaning that of ill health, namely that one is given to injuring beings with a hand, with a clod, with a stick, with a knife. So when I read this, I reflected on myself, because when I was younger, I had very bad health. When I was born, my head was so big that they thought that I had water in my brains, which they don't. I just have a very big head. And the other thing that they thought was that I actually had childhood asthma and a whole bunch of different ailments that phased out quite late. So I was thinking, yeah, maybe I was a big bully in my past life or something like that. Yeah. Moving on. But here, students, some man or woman is not given to injuring beings with the hand, or with a stick or with a knife, but instead they avoid doing that. And so when they come back to the human life, they will actually have health. Right? The Chinese and the Sanskrit and the Tibetan versions actually also state that in addition to this, giving medicine to the sick will also lead to good health to you in the longer term. So this is an additional detail that's not in the Pali canon at this point in time. So we've covered, long life is whether you kill or not. If you didn't succeed in killing, then you probably will have like a not very healthy life in the next life, right? Moving on to your looks, right? So here, students, some man or woman is of an angry and irritable character. Even when criticized a little, is offended, become angry, hostile, resentful, and displays anger, hate, and bitterness. This reminds me of a lot of people on the internet, especially when they're complaining about certain things. And because of doing this, if they don't appear in hell, when they come back to the human realm, then they will actually be, ugly. This is the way that leads to ugliness, namely that one is of an angry and irritable character and displays anger, hate, and bitterness. So it's interesting, right? Clearly then the way to become beautiful is the other way around, right? You avoid all this anger, irritability, and all that. And interestingly enough, also the Chinese, Sanskrit, and Tibetan also say that to look down on the ugly will also lead to you becoming ugly yourself. And the reason why I say this is also interesting is that if you take away, given nowadays you see how everyone is very focused on plastic surgery, makeup, and all that. If you've ever seen a beautiful person who's angry and irritable, no matter how much makeup they put, right? You ask yourself how pretty and how good looking they are. And what this means also is that actually one of the best ways to improve your beauty and all that is to actually practice loving kindness. Because the antidote to anger, to irritability is actually to practice the cultivation of loving kindness. That actually is what overcomes anger and irritability. Right? So moving on to whether you're uninfluential or influential. Here, some man or woman is envious. He envies, resents, begrudges the gains and honor, respect, and reverence of others. And instead, you're born, when you come into the human realm, then they're actually uninfluential. And this is the reason why that they're uninfluential, namely that they're envious of other people. But instead, somebody is not envious, doesn't resent or begrudge the gains or honor or respect of others. And this actually is what leads to someone being influential. Namely that you are not envious towards the gains, honor, respect, and reverence and veneration of others. Again, I'll pause here because there is actually a parallel in this thing called the Brahma Viharas, right? Which is this Brahma Viharas. The 4 Brahma Viharas are loving kindness, compassion, sympathetic joy, and equanimity. And envy, right, is actually the opposite of sympathetic joy, right? You're envious of somebody, right? That means that you are not happy that that person got wealth or renown or whatever it is. And here, this is actually very clear that the karma, the result of actually being envious is actually that in your future life you end up being completely uninfluential. Right? I would actually even say that this is the karma, and while it says it's a future life, it's actually very, very relevant to this current life as well. Think to yourself, right, of the people who are uninfluential at work, and ask yourself, we can discuss later, but ask yourself, can you think of anybody who is uninfluential, and ask yourself, is this person actually does he or she rejoice when people get promotions? Or do they complain that, actually I should be the one who should be like, getting that promotion, not this person. This person didn't do anything. Right? I think we can discuss a little bit more later. So that's that. So okay, given that we're in Singapore and we're talking about the 5 C's, right? So now this is the part that is probably the most of greatest interest to most Singaporeans, how to be rich and not poor. Here, students, some man or woman does not give food, drink, clothing, carriages, garlands, scents, beds, dwelling, and lamps to recluses or Brahmins. So because that he's not generous in giving to these people who are in the path, they then lead to poverty. And if they do give a lot, then that's actually what leads them to wealth. So this is actually what the Buddha actually says. And in addition, in the Sanskrit, Chinese, and Tibetan, giving to the poor and needy is also a condition for future wealth. And in the Khotanese, theft is actually a prominent condition it's actually the reason why you're poor in the next life as well. So this is something that's interesting. And then the question that you have to ask yourself is, does this then mean that for me to be rich, I have to give as much as possible to all the big temples with like all the gold Buddha statues and all that stuff? Right? Food for thought. We can discuss more later, right? And the other question to also think about is actually that, does this then mean that Donald Trump gave a lot to like Buddhist monks in his past life, right? He's very rich. And if you think about it also, he's very influential, right, now. So what was his past karma, right? And what does this mean for him, right, given what he's doing now, right? Question mark, question mark, question mark, right? So we'll move on to the next part, right? This next part is actually about low birth versus like high birth. So here, students, some man or woman is obstinate and arrogant. It does not pay homage to one who should receive homage, does not rise up and give respect to one who he should be given respect to, does not honor, respect, and revere and venerate those who should be honored and respected. So instead, when you actually do give respect to, humility, right? Giving respect to everyone, those who should be like given respect to, this is actually what leads you to having a higher birth and higher social position in your next life. And the Chinese, Sanskrit, and Tibetan also add that looking down on lower families will lead to one being reborn in a low family itself. Right? And moving on to the next part about like the stupid and the wise. Right? So what is the cause for stupidity? Right? Here, some man or woman doesn't visit a recluse or a Brahmin and does not ask, "Venerable Sir, what is wholesome? What is unwholesome? What is blamable? What is blameless? What should be cultivated? What should not be cultivated?" And so on and so forth. So instead, for those who are wise, they ask, what is wholesome? What is not wholesome? What is blamable? What is blameless? And so on and so forth. Namely, the cause for stupidity is to not ask questions. Right. So, there's a general saying in corporate world, people always say, oh, there are no stupid questions, right? Actually, there are stupid questions. The stupid questions are the ones that are not asked. Right? Because that will actually lead to the cause for you actually being stupid. And if you think about it, how many times we actually stop ourselves from asking questions because we are, I might appear stupid. But if you think about it, that's actually the cause for you to actually act stupidly instead of acting with wisdom. Instead, if you just thicken your facial skin, right? Just go and ask anyway. This might actually plant the seeds for you to actually act with that wisdom. So to repeat, there are stupid questions and there are questions that are not being asked. Right? So you can ask questions later. The Chinese translation also, one of the Chinese translation also adds that to despise someone for being a fool and not to teach leads one to be a fool in the future. And the Sanskrit and the Tibetan also recommend the abstinence for alcohol. So this one is not very clear like why, but I guess the fact that alcohol leads to a lot of stupid actions, as all of us who have ever gotten drunk before will know. On a side note, the one and only time that I ever got into a fight, this is from way before I became a Buddhist and I kept the 5 precepts. The one and only time I ever got into a fight was when I was extremely drunk and I was returning back to, so I studied overseas, and I was walking back to my dormitory room. And what I remember from that time was that there was a snapshot of me walking back to my room, and next thing I know, I'm like rolling the grass, I'm like fighting with somebody, right? And I remember feeling fear because I thought I was like being like attacked and like robbed and all that. And next thing I know, I paused the fight. I said, okay, stop. Like, what's going on? And the guy then said, he's like, dude, and he's American, right? So he's like, dude, I don't know. I was trying to help you. I asked like how you were, and next thing you know, you threw me a punch, and I'm like rolling in the grass and I'm fighting. And I was like, I'm so sorry. I thought that you were attacking me, and this was in Houston, right? So Houston's not very safe. So I was like, I thought you were attacking me. And then he said, I wasn't attacking you. I was like helping you because you were like stumbling along and all that stuff. So in the end, I apologized, and when I read this part about like abstinence from alcohol, like and alcohol causing stupidity, this is exactly what came to my mind, in the personal experience. So, moral of the story, I would agree with the Sanskrit and Tibetan versions that abstinence from alcohol will lead to greater wisdom, right? So keep your 5 precepts, right? So this is actually what the Buddha then goes on to say that, so this thus is the way that leads to short life, making people short-lived and long life, and also to sickliness, to health, to ugliness, to beauty, to influence and uninfluential people, being influential and not influential, wealth and poverty, low birth and high birth, stupidity and wisdom. Beings are owners of their actions, owners of your karma, heirs of your karma. You originate from your karma, you are bound to your karma, and you have your karma as your refuge. And it is your karma that distinguishes you from like being inferior or superior. So this is the shorter discourse of the analysis of karma. And this, one of the thoughts that led to my mind also was that, especially the part about poverty, is that it leads to a very interesting question, right? If you look at the poor, how should we help the poor then? Right. Is it a case that we should actually just help them more, or should we actually give them the chance to give more to monastics and all that? And there's actually a very respected monk in Sri Lanka, Vimala, and what he was actually is a very interesting guy. One of the stories that was told about him after he passed on was this Sri Lankan lady was relaying about how when she saw him wandering on his solo wandering across the whole of Sri Lanka. So he's apparently walked the whole length of Sri Lanka at least like 6 or 7 times in his lifetime. She ran up to him and like gave him alms food, and she gave him like heaps and heaps of like rice with like the curries and all that stuff. And halfway through, he actually put his hand covering his arm lower, and he said, "Stop." And then he said, "Give a chance for the poor to actually give alms as well." And his reasoning was exactly along the lines of this sutta, that they are poor because they didn't have the chance to be generous. So we should all the more give them the chance to be generous to monastics in this life. So it's just food for thought, right? Like, I mean, it's a very different take of like how we normally think about like helping poor people, how to increase, like raise poverty, right? How to raise wealth across the world. And maybe this is also like a question for you to think about for yourself. Like, how would you actually like approach your life differently after you learn about this? So to summarize, right, the reason why you are short-lived is because you are murderous, you kill things, so keep the 5 precepts. Even if you keep the 5 precepts but you injure things, that leads to ill health in the next life, or maybe even in this life. Right? Whether you are beautiful or not beautiful depends very much on how much loving kindness you have in your hearts, whether you are angry and irritable in character. It's a good thing my wife is here. So I'm letting her hear the Dhamma. Whether somebody is influential or not is whether are they envious of others or not. So how much envy or sympathetic joy that you have, right? Whether you're rich or poor, whether you're generous and like giving like food and alms food and all that stuff to the monastics, whether you have a low birth or a high birth is whether are you arrogant and obstinate or not. And whether you are stupid or wise is whether you ask questions or not, right? Especially of like monastics. And ultimately, these actions that you do, right? Ultimately, you own them. Nobody else does, right? As the Buddha said in the separate sutta, he can only point the way. He was asked the question like, of your sangha, how many are enlightened? How many are fully enlightened? How many are once returners? Stream enterers, once returners, non-returners. How many of them are completely like useless? Right? And he said that there are monks who are of each category. And he was asked the question like, why? And then he said, I can only point the way, but they have to walk the path. And it's the same thing for each and every one of us. Right? It is not enough to just know this and hear this, oh, very good, and then you just do absolutely nothing about it. Right? You have to actually walk the path. You actually have to do something about this. So the question then, right, that the next part I want to cover is actually something that a lot of people, especially those who have been to certain retreats or certain teachers, right, the question of how to remove bad karma. And we'll move on to the next sutta, which is the Anguttara Nikaya Book of Threes, and it's the 100th sutta. It's called a lump of salt, right? And this is actually a very famous parable, right? Because this is actually one of the few times the Buddha actually talks about how to remove bad karma. And the reason why I thought it's important to talk about this is because that a lot of people think that you have to no pain, no gain, But the fact is actually that the Buddhist path, right, is called the middle way because you're actually not going the path of extreme indulgence and you're not going the path of extreme asceticism. I mean, if you remember your basic Buddhism, the Buddha was actually teaching to the five monks, right, and he was going through all the ascetic practices. So, the Buddha statues where it's all skin and bones, right? That's what the Buddha, and he described himself as when he touched his belly, he could feel his spine. That's how skinny he was. Later on, the Buddha actually talked about this as unfruitful practices. Painful, it's a lot of suffering, and it's completely not fruitful at all. And unfortunately, I think that part, right, is what is lost nowadays. Because you will go to some retreats where they talk about you're burning off your bad karma because you're letting your bad karma come to fruit by when you experience all these racking pains, just bear with it. And I remember one of my teachers, Ajahn Brahm, he was asked a question in a retreat, and this person said that, "Dear Ajahn, it hurts terribly when I sit on the floor and meditate. I've been advised to just bear with the pain. Do you have any better solution?" And he said, "Yes, I have a solution for you. It's called the chair. Don't sit on the floor. Sit on the chair, right?" And Ajahn Brahm said, is your karma that you're living in this world now at this time where there are chairs available, so go and sit on the chair, right? And that's not actually the way to remove bad karma. So how do you actually remove bad karma, right? So this is actually the part, it's actually an excerpt from it, right? So the Buddha actually says that there are evil deeds that are done by people, right, where it's very, very minor, maybe they kill a cockroach or something like that, right? And that takes that person to hell. Right? But then there are also people who do similar deeds, like killing a cockroach, and then nothing happens to them. And what's the reason for that? So that's when he talks about it. So he says, now, a trifling evil deed, meaning a very minor evil deed, right, done by an individual, by what sort of individual takes him to hell? There's the case where the person is actually not developed in contemplating the body, is not developed in virtue, is not developed in his mind in figuring out what's right to do and what's not right to do, right? And he's restricted, small-hearted, and he himself dwells in the suffering. So what this means is that the person actually is completely not developed in the path at all. They don't do good deeds, right? They don't reflect on themselves. They just cockroach and just kill, right? So this kind of small deed, right, done by such a person, right, will lead the person to hell. Now, a trifling evil deed that's done by what sort of person is experienced in the here and now that barely appears, meaning that this same person doing this bad deed, right, there's no effect whatsoever, right? This is where a certain individual is developed in contemplating the body, is developed in virtue, mind, in discernment, figuring out what should be done, what should not be done, is large-hearted, and dwelling in the immeasurable, meaning that their heart, right, and their mind is like boundless, meaning that they do not actually say that, oh, I will only care for like this group of people, So my wife and I watched this movie called The Help, and it's actually about African American housemates in the southern part of America, the USA in the 60s, right? And there was one very ironic scene, right, where, and the context is that this is in the state of Mississippi, which has one of the worst interracial relations between the whites as well as the African Americans. And there was one very ironic scene, right, where these rich white American ladies were hosting a benefit concert for African children. And in the meantime, right, they were treating the African American help, right, like with complete disdain and all that. And one of the African American maids had asked, "Oh, can I borrow money from you?" And this lady who organized the African children benefit then said, it's for the benefit to help itself. You'll thank me later. And she refused to lend any of that money. Right? So this is an example, right, of like restricted behavior, right? Where you're focusing your charity only for a certain group. In your mind, you draw a distinction between like, oh, I should only help my family and not other people who come to you for help. Whereas somebody who's boundless of heart, right, immeasurable, whoever comes to you, you just help, right, regardless of whether it's your family or not your family. Right? So that's what is the meaning of like restricted versus unrestricted, large-hearted and dwelling in the immeasurable. So to recap, right, somebody who is very undeveloped, right, very not giving, that when you do something bad, the impact of that, right, will affect you very, very severely. But that same person, right, who is very, does a lot of like, good deeds, contemplates a lot, meditates a lot, when you do something bad, it doesn't affect you as much. Then this is the famous, what follows is the famous parable. Suppose that a man were to drop a salt crystal, right, a lump of salt, right, to a small amount of water in the cup. What do you think? Would the water in the cup be salty because of the crystal and the lump of salt be unfit to drink? Then the answer was yes, does it one. Why is that? There's only a small amount of water in the cup. Right? So when you add in the lump of salt, the whole thing becomes like undrinkable. But if you were to drop the lump of salt into the river Ganges, what do you think? Would the water in the river Ganges become salty because of the salt crystal and be unfit to drink? Then no. And why is that? Because there's a great mass of water in the river Ganges. Right? So this is what the Buddha actually says. So what this means, right, is actually that if you think about it, what the Buddha is saying, if bad karma is like salt, you actually do not remove the salt. You do not remove bad karma. All you can do, right, is to do more good, right? Whether is it through cultivating yourself, your own mind. Cultivating wisdom, right, is actually very good karma. And in the separate sutta, the Buddha actually said that cultivating wisdom, a moment of wisdom, right, is more than if you were to feed the whole Sangha every day for 300 years or something like that. Right? So cultivating wisdom, but also doing active like good, right? Cultivating your virtue, right? And that actually is like building, it's as though that if you build up that mass of water, right, to dilute your bad karma, you can never remove bad karma. And this is actually very important because when you listen to people who tell you that, oh, just bear the pain, and then you can burn off your bad karma, right? That's very bad advice. Maybe what I will do is to read a very cheeky sutta that the Buddha actually talked about, right, where so this one is not, I didn't put it in the thing, in the Facebook group, but this is actually where the Buddha actually criticizes the Jains, because the Jain religion, right, believes that the body comes about because of your bad karma, and that if you put your body through like pain, right, that is actually removing bad karma. So that's actually the Jain religion belief. Right? So the Buddha has something quite cheeky to say about this. Let me just take a moment to find this from my soft copy of Bhikkhu Bodhi's text. So this is from the Chula Dukkha Kanda Sutta, which is the shorter discourse on the mass of suffering. And so the Buddha was talking about one occasion when he was living on Vulture's Peak in Rajagaha, and there were a number of Jains living on this this black rock on the slopes of Isigiri, and they were practicing continuous standing. So the Jain religion has got all these, and actually in India to this day, right, there are all these like ascetics who practice like weird things, right? So if you look on Facebook or Google, or I can't remember, you Google for it, there is actually this picture of this old Indian holy man who has taken a vow to keep his hand like this, and his arm, right, has completely shriveled up, and he can't put his hand down now, even if he wants to, because it's literally locked in place as a result of that. So there are all these like very strange beliefs, right, and these Jains, right, believe that they cannot sit, right. And if you go to India, if you go to some of the museums, you actually will see some of the Jain statues, right, and there's this particular Jain saint, I can't remember his name now, and it's a picture of a man standing completely naked, and the distinctive feature of this statue is actually that he's got vines crawling up his legs, because the legend is actually that he stood at the same spot for so long that actually like vines were actually growing on him as a result of that. So these Jains were clearly believing the same thing, right, because they are practicing continuous standing, rejecting seats. So the Buddha was saying that after he rose from his meditation, he went there and he asked the Jains, he said, friends, why do you practice continuous standing, rejecting seats, and experience like painful, racking, piercing feelings due to this exertion? And the Jains replied that, oh, you know, Mahavira, Niganta Nataputa, which is actually Mahavira, that's one of the peer of the Buddha. He's omniscient and all-seeing and claims to have complete knowledge, and he says that, you know, Jains, you have done evil actions in the past, exhaust them with performing all these austerities, and then when you are done with restraining, you know, when you're done with like actually like subjecting your body to all this, right, there will be no consequences in the future, and you will destroy your karma as a result of this. With the destruction of karma, there's the destruction of suffering, and with the destruction of suffering, there's the destruction of feeling, and all suffering will actually like be exhausted. So this is the doctrine that the Jains actually follow. And when this was said, then the Buddha said that, you know, but do you know that you existed in the past, and that it is not the case that you did not exist in the past, right? So do you know that you existed in the past, right? Then he said no. And do you know that you did evil actions in the past, and that you did not avoid doing evil actions? Then he said no. Then did you know that whether you did such and such evil actions in the past, right? Then they said no, right? And the Buddha asked that, you know, Jain friends, do you know that so much suffering has already been exhausted, or that so much suffering has still to be exhausted, or that, you know, when you've exhausted all your suffering, right, all suffering will be exhausted? They said no. And do you know what the abandoning of unwholesome states is, and what's the cultivation of wholesome states? And then they said no. So the Buddha then says, it seems to me that you don't know that you existed in the past. You don't know that you did evil actions in the past. You didn't know that you did not do evil actions. You don't know how much suffering has been exhausted, right? So basically, you don't know a lot of things, right? So that being so, right, for you to experience all these like painful, racking pains right now, right, in your past life, right, so those who were murderers, bloody-handed, evildoers in the world, when they're reborn in the human realm, then they will become Jains. That's what the Buddha actually said. and then they said this, which is actually the key point to avoid, right? They said, friend Gautama, pleasure is not to be gained through pleasure, and pleasure is to be gained through pain. Right? For were pleasure to be gained through pleasure, then King Bimsara or Magadha would gain pleasure, since he abides in greater pleasure than you, the Venerable Gautama. And to this, the Buddha actually replies, you know, can King Bimsara abide without moving his body or uttering a word, experiencing the peak of pleasure for 7 days and nights? Meaning that can you just sit there and meditate for 7 days? Then they said no. Then the Buddha replies and said, but I can actually sit there for 7 days and nights, experiencing the peak of pleasure. So then the sutta kind of ends there. But if you listen to this, right, the Buddha actually is directly contradicting the belief that pleasure is not gained through pleasure, but pleasure is gained through pain. Instead, the Buddha is actually saying that pleasure is gained through a certain kind of pleasure, which is wholesome and is blameless. Right? That's actually the cultivation of the mind. Right? So, if I were to summarize, right, I think that the few key points, right, that all these sutta talks are, I think I got a few key points here. The first thing is actually that karma leads to results. You might not see the results now, but it will actually eventually lead to some kind of result. So it's actually important that if you can do something to cultivate the path, you should do something to cultivate the path, which I already mentioned. The second thing is actually that intention and motivation is karma, right? Meaning that if your intentions are not right, you do things right with mixed intentions, right, the karma will actually be the wrong kind of karma. There's somewhere else where the Buddha said that if you do things with both white or black intentions, you will actually get white or black karma. Right? It's the same thing here. This is especially important, right? Because in about 3 or 4 weeks' time, we will cover the module on right intention. We will talk about what is right intention. So I think a lot of times people talk about, oh yeah, we do this with the best of intentions, right? And yeah, you can see that oftentimes, doing things with the best of intention doesn't yield right results. And I think that people also confuse good intentions with right intention. And there's a very specific definition of right intention in the Eightfold Path we should talk about in a few weeks' time. Right? So the third point to talk about is actually that from the Chula Kamma Vibhanga Sutta, the MN135, it is clear that actually the result of karma is not always very obvious, right? Because it can actually take place at a later point, not immediately right now, right? So consequently, thoughts like, I did so much good, but it's pointless, there's no point to this. I think be careful of those kind of thoughts, because those are actually not really true. Or the thought of how come bad people can get away with doing bad things, right? The fact is actually that they can't, right? So park aside the kind of thoughts, because those perspectives are not fully formed by the view of how karma comes to fruit. The result of karma not being obvious, right, means also that we shouldn't be so focused on the results of the karma, but we should actually focus our energies on putting the causes in place. So don't focus on the results. Don't ask yourself, why am I so poor? Or more concretely on meditation. Ajahn Brahm talks about all these limiters and lights of the mind. PJ talks about it also. Why is it I sit down I still can't do that? Right? Park that aside. Right? The karma for those, right, is actually just walking the Eightfold Path. So just focus on actually am I walking the path correctly? How am I cultivating myself and am I doing good actively on an everyday basis? Right? So let the results take care of themselves, right? Another point is actually that you are responsible for yourself because you are the owner of your karma. Meaning that nobody else, right, is responsible for your happiness or unhappiness. If you're unhappy, right, sorry, you have to deal with it. I can't help you. Right? It makes as much sense, right, to ask the Buddha to help you as when your bladder is full, you go, can the Buddha relieve me of the pressure on my bladder? It doesn't work that way. Right? You have to take the action to relieve your pressure in your bladder. You have to do your own karma, and you have to be own your own happiness. Conversely, this means that you shouldn't let other people own your happiness. When was the last time that somebody pissed you off, and you're that's so and so terrible, always annoys me, or why is it this relative is constantly causing problems and so on and so forth. If you think about it, what you're doing is that you're blaming other people, right? Come in. Come in? Yeah. Hi, just come in. Yeah. you are not actually owning this. Right? You're not taking responsibility for your own actions, but you are blaming somebody else. Right? So it is really important to focus on sowing good karma wherever you can. And this is especially important because of the salt crystal thing, right? Right. All of us have an infinite amount of past bad karma, right? And so it's important for you to actually like do even more than good karma so that you dilute the effects of the past bad karma. The last point actually is that, and I'll end the discussion here, the Eightfold Path, right, leads to the cessation of karma, right? So it's important to actually focus on the Eightfold Path, right? To develop that constantly. Every day to ask yourself, how am I walking the path? Is that a right view? What am I doing for the right view, right intention, right speech, right action, right livelihood, right effort, right mindfulness, right samadhi? Okay. Given that we're running a little bit short of time, why don't we let's do the short, small group discussion thing, right? Where you can form up in pairs. I mean, people are more or less formed up in pairs already, right? So you can just maybe just have a discussion with your next door person, right? Just some guiding questions for discussion, and then after we can discuss for maybe about say 10 minutes, 5 minutes each. You all can discuss, right? And then later I'll arrow somebody to just share with the bigger group what you all discussed very briefly. So the guiding question is, what unhappy situations are you facing, right, where you blame others for your unhappiness? And discuss with your friend, right, how can you see this differently? If you own your own happiness or your unhappiness, right, what can you do differently to actually reclaim your happiness for this? What's within your control and what's outside of your control? Yeah. So shall we form groups and we just set a timer for 10 minutes to discuss? Yeah? So yeah. The question is, what unhappy situations are you facing where you blame others for your unhappiness? Right, you're blaming others for your unhappiness. And discuss how can you do it differently, right, to reclaim your happiness. Right? What's in your control, what's not in your control. Yeah. Okay, 10 minutes. I guess we'll discuss it later. The question is, what situations you're facing where you blame others for your happiness? Yeah, that's what